Okay, back with coffee again and some more to tell you about teaching and learning. So, I had made some promises about learning skills, making some videos about that. So, I want to start with information intake, which is an important skill to develop. So, in that regard, I want to talk about taking notes. Right, this is both for students and teachers. So, how do you take effective notes? What do you write down when you're in class? I've been in classes where it feels like everything the teacher says is important. And I feel like all I'm doing is just writing voraciously the whole time and probably not understanding anything that's happening. So we want to avoid that. So let's talk about note taking. I think there are two different kinds of approaches to taking notes. I would say there is a thing called content notes, and there's also concept notes. Okay? Most of us, when we take notes, take content notes. Content notes are all about getting the details. This is the kind of note taking where students want to write down everything the teacher says or everything that's on the PowerPoint slide up on the screen. Okay, so what's the problem with this kind of note taking? First of all, multitasking is totally fake. If you are spending all your effort trying to write down all the words that your teacher is saying or all the words that are on the screen in front of you, you are not hearing anything. You are not engaged in the class. You might as well just be sitting by yourself looking at that screen. Nothing is happening around you. Your brain is only engaged in one task at a time. So you are not multitasking. You are not actually in class. You're simply there to write down things, right? So if I'm busy recording all those words, I'm missing something in class, I guarantee you. I'm not giving myself any kind of mental space to process or consider what's going on around me. So, what happens when I take content notes? This means I have to go back later, review all of my copious notes, everything that I wrote down. I got to go through it again, which is not altogether terrible, but takes a lot of time. So, I have to go through all of my notes, process the content, synthesize it. Okay, this is a strategy, but I don't think it's helpful. Why is it not helpful? Well, teacher side, I should, as a student, already have the basics of the content, right? I have the content already, or I should if my teacher really knows what they're doing. So, side note for teachers, make sure your students have access to the content ahead of time. That means provide your basic PowerPoint slides. I know there's lots of controversy about whether or not students should have access to your slides ahead of time, but they should. Not all of your prep notes. They should not have all of your preparatory notes, but they should have whatever they're going to see on the screen, your basic slides. And I know teachers, you're not putting everything you're going to say in class on the slides, and you are definitely not reading those slides to the students, right? Yes. If the students have the slides ahead of time, if they have them in hand and they know what's going to be on that screen and they know that what's in their hands is going to be the same thing, they won't spend energy copying that content from the screen. They will spend their energy listening to you, the teacher, right? So if you really want your students to listen to you, give them your slides. All right, so the other thing is provide reading assignments that correspond to your class sessions. That doesn't mean assign every possible thing that the students could read about the topic, right? That means be thoughtful. Give them reading assignments that are actually useful and apply to the content that you're going to cover in class. And make sure that they know, like, this is what we're going to talk about. Here's the reading assignment. This is your content. You don't have to copy everything down that I'm going to say. So make sure then, teachers, that your classes are not just about content delivery, though sometimes we do that. But I think if you give them the content, the fundamental stuff ahead of time, you can do really cool stuff in class. That means you can spend class time clarifying, analyzing, synthesizing, and applying the content they already have access to. Or, another thing, if there's content you want to deliver verbally, like in a lecture format, record it ahead of time, but then make sure it's accessible for repeated viewing by your students so they can get that content as many times as they want or need it. So let's talk a little bit about conceptual notes. So teachers, make class session learning outcomes available to your students ahead of time. This is my strategy. Print them and bring them as note sheets even. Don't even rely on your students to have them ready to go. But if the students know what the learning outcomes you can use those as a framework for taking notes. So students, when your teachers hand you those learning outcomes, use the session learning outcomes as an organizing framework. When you hear something from your teacher that belongs under one of those learning outcomes, write it down under that learning outcome, right? Now that means teachers, you have to be really thoughtful about what your learning outcomes are and make sure you're actually covering those things in your class session. So it holds us accountable to what we're supposed to be doing from a pedagogical standpoint anyway. Students, use those learning outcomes. Here's an example. One class I teach is about autonomic nervous system functioning. Basic stuff, right? If you're a health sciences major, you got to understand that. So one learning outcome is to describe the differences between the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. So how would I, if I were a student in my class, how would I take notes on this? I'd have that learning outcome at the top, and I would draw a line down the middle of my paper. On one side, I would write sympathetic. On the other side, I'd write parasympathetic. And then I would listen, right? Listen to the teacher's content and write down anytime I hear something about sympathetic or parasympathetic. If I hear the teacher say rest and digest, where does that belong? Big concepts, right? If I hear the teacher say that one side is gonna make a person feel sleepy or tired, or it's gonna dry out your mucous membranes, it's gonna slow down your metabolic processes, right? I'm gonna write those kinds of things down in bullet points, not full sentences. Never in your notes should you be writing full-on sentences. Do not write everything the teacher says. But that's one example of how to use a learning outcome as a framework for taking notes. Now, it is helpful, teachers, if your students have those learning outcomes ahead of time, that way they can kind of read them, they know what's coming, and they can start to develop a scheme for where to put stuff as you're going through your lecture. Okay, so students, don't try to capture every word. Try to capture the big ideas. If there's confusion later on regarding what you wrote down, because sometimes I've written things down in class and I'm like, I don't even know what that's about. Go back to your content. Go back to your textbook. Go back to the slides. Go back to other materials that are provided outside of the class by your teacher to clarify and extend your understanding. So hopefully this is helpful to you. You can take better notes when you're in class. Teachers, hopefully you can set your students up for success in taking in the content and concepts that you want your students to know and understand. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe to the YouTube channel if you like what you're hearing, or you can find me on Instagram, Nurse Teach Excel. Thanks.